Hey, gentle listeners. Tonight we begin with the remarkable lives and incredible resilience of medieval peasants. Those forgotten souls who faced winter not as a season to endure, but as a months-long testament to human endurance. What would it have been like to wake each morning not to an alarm clock, but to the sound of your own breath crystallizing in the air above your face? How did these remarkable people find warmth when survival itself was an art form? When the simple act of staying warm required the same quiet, determination that we now reserve for our greatest challenges? Picture the frost-covered world of medieval Europe, where winter didn't just arrive, it settled in like an unwelcome guest, reshaping every aspect of daily life for those who worked the land with nothing but their hands and their unshakable will to survive another day. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It's strangely comforting to see how many of us are drifting off together from different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe switch on a gentle fan for that soothing background hum. And let's settle in for tonight's quiet journey through history. Close your eyes if you can. Feel yourself sinking back through centuries, past electric heaters and insulated walls, past gas furnaces and radiators, back to a time when warmth was precious, fleeting, and earned through the quiet rituals of survival. The year is somewhere in the late 1300s. The place is a small village tucked between fields that stretch toward a horizon always gray with winter clouds. And you are about to discover what it truly meant to live when winter held the world in its cold, patient grip, and when ordinary people displayed extraordinary resilience simply by greeting each frozen dawn. The sound comes first. Not a sound really, but the absence of sound that only deep cold can create. It's that peculiar quiet of winter mornings, when even the air seems too thick and still to carry noise properly. You become aware of it slowly, rising from sleep like a swimmer surfacing from dark water. The silence presses against your ears, and then, gradually, you begin to hear your own breathing. Each exhale creates a small cloud that hangs for a moment in the air above your face, before dissolving into the gray dimness of your home. The breath is visible because the air inside your dwelling is nearly as cold as the air outside. There is no barrier between you and winter. It's only walls of timber and wattle and daub that serve more as suggestions than true protection against the season's grip. You lie still for a moment longer, reluctant to leave whatever warmth your body has managed to create beneath. The rough woolen blanket and the pile of straw that serves as your mattress. The straw rustles with the sound of brittleness dry stalks that have absorbed the moisture from your breath and body heat throughout the night, creating a damp chill that seems to seep upward through the layers of your simple clothing. Your feet, wrapped in strips of cloth inside wooden shoes, have long since lost feeling. This is normal. The ache that follows the return of circulation each morning is as regular as the sunrise. Though you cannot see the sun yet, through the single small window opening in your walla, gap covered with a piece of oiled cloth that does little to keep out the cold. The smell of your world is wood smoke and dampness, old wool and the earthy scent of animals. Somewhere in the darkness near your feet, you can hear the soft breathing of the family goat, brought inside for the night, not out of affection, but out of necessity. Her body heat, modest as it is, represents warmth that cannot be wasted. The cow, if your family is fortunate enough to own one, sleeps in the other corner, her large form a living furnace that radiates precious heat through the long hours of darkness. You know, without opening your eyes, that frost has formed on the inside of your walls during the night. It happens every night when the cold is deep enough. The moisture from breathing, from the animals, from the barely warm bodies huddled in sleep, condenses and freezes against the timber and clay, creating delicate patterns of ice that will melt slowly as the day warms. The decision to rise comes not from readiness, but from necessity. The animals must be tended. The fire must be coaxed back to life from whatever embers might still glow beneath the ashes in the central hearth. Water must be fetched, though you know it will be frozen in the wooden bucket where you left it near the door. Your day begins not with comfort, but with a series of small battles against the cold. You sit up slowly, feeling the immediate bite of air against your face and hands. The blanket falls away, and the chill rushes over your body like cold water. Your clothing the same rough tunic and hose you wore yesterday, and the day before, and will wear tomorrow, provides little insulation, but it is all you have. You pull the woolen cloak tighter around your shoulders, though you know it will do little good once you step outside. The wooden shoes clatter against the packed earth floor as you stand. The sound seems unnaturally loud in the morning quiet, and you move carefully, trying not to wake the others, your spouse, your children, perhaps a parent or sibling who still huddle beneath their own thin coverings. Everyone in your family has learned to move quietly in the early morning. Sound carries differently in the cold, and there's an unspoken understanding that rest, whatever small comfort it provides, should not be disturbed without necessity. You approach the hearth at the center of your single room. It is a simple construction, a circular area of stone set into the earth floor, with a hood of clay and timber to direct the smoke upward toward a hole in the roof. Around the hearth, the earth is permanently stained black from years of ash and soot. The stones themselves are blackened too, and warm to the touch from the dying embers that still glow faintly beneath a layer of fine ash. This hearth is the heart of your home. It is cooking fire, heating source, light, and gathering place all in one. It is also on mornings like this a source of anxiety. The wood you gathered yesterday, was it enough? The pile beside the hearth looks smaller in the gray morning light. Each piece of fuel represents hours of work walking to the edge of the village to gather fallen branches, cutting and splitting wood with tools that are worn and precious, carrying heavy loads back across fields that are now frozen hard as stone. You kneel beside the hearth and begin the morning ritual of coaxing fire back to life. With a small stick, you carefully stir the ashes, searching for embers that still glow red. They're a small coal, no bigger than your thumb, still holding heat from last night's fire. You blow on it gently, adding thin slivers of bark and dry grass, watching for the tiny spark that will become flame. The fire making is an art that has been passed down through generations. Too much air too quickly, and the ember dies. Too little, and it fades away into cold ash. You have been building fires since childhood, and your hands know the work without conscious thought. Still, there is always a moment of uncertainty, a small fear that this morning the fire will not catch, that the cold will have claimed this too. But today, the fire responds. A thin wisp of smoke rises from your careful pile of tinder. A small flame appears, yellow and precious. You add slightly larger pieces of wood, building the fire slowly, patiently. The light grows, and with it, the first real warmth you have felt since yesterday evening. The goat bleats softly from her corner, and you know she is hungry. The animal's needs are as urgent as your own, perhaps more so. A goat that produces no milk, a cow that gives no cheese, a chicken that lays no eggs, these represent not just lost food, but the difference between surviving the winter and not surviving at all. You take up the wooden bucket and approach the door. The bucket is frozen to the ground where you set it last night, and you must work it loose with careful pressure. The water inside is solid ice, cloudy and thick. You will need to break it apart and melt it over the fire before it can be used for anything. The door of your home is simple wood held together with iron straps, hung on leather hinges that crack and stiffen in the cold. When you lift the wooden bar that secures it and pull the door open, winter rushes in like a living thing. The air is sharp enough to make your eyes water instantly. Your breath comes in visible puffs that hang in the still air before your face. Outside, the world has been transformed by cold into something almost otherworldly. The fields that in warmer seasons show brown earth and green growth now stretch away under a coating of frost so thick it looks like silver cloth. Every blade of grass, every bare branch, every surface that can hold moisture has been painted with delicate crystals of ice that catch what little light filters through the perpetually gray sky. The ground beneath your feet rings like metal when you walk. The earth is frozen to a depth that will not soften until spring arrives in earnest, months away. Your wooden shoes provide little protection against the cold that seeps upward through the soles, and you can feel your feet beginning to numb even in the few moments it takes to walk from your door to the small shelter where the chickens roost. The chickens have huddled together for warmth, their feathers puffed out to trap what little body heat they can generate. They move reluctantly when you reach into their nesting boxes, searching for eggs. On a good day, you might find 2 or 3. On a morning like this, when the cold has been particularly bitter, you are fortunate to find one. The egg, when you discover it, is cold in your palm. It had not frozen the warmth of the hen's body, has kept it just above the point of freezing. You scatter a handful of grain for the chickens, grain that you hope will last until spring, but no, probably will not. Every kernel represents careful calculation. Too little, and the birds will stop laying entirely. Too much, and your family will have nothing to eat when the stores run out entirely. The cow, if your family possesses one, requires different attention. She needs fodder-dried grass and grain that was put aside during the harvest months. In summer, she could graze in the common fields. Now, she depends entirely on what was stored away during the brief months of plenty. You measure out her portion carefully, aware that every handful brings you closer to the day when there will be nothing left to give her. Her breath creates clouds of steam in the cold air. And when you press your face against her warm flank while milking, that is one of the few moments of real comfort your morning provides. The milk comes slowly in the cold, and there is less of it than there was in the warmer months. But what there is represents protein and fat that could mean the difference between your family's survival and starvation. Back inside, you pour the milk into a wooden bowl and set it near the fire. The cream will separate slowly, and if you are careful, you can churn a small amount of butter, a luxury that provides both nutrition and a brief moment of richness in a diet that consists mainly of thin porridge and whatever preserved food remains in your stores. The water you collected, now partially melted over the fire, goes into the large iron pot that hangs from a hook above the flames. This pot is one of your most valuable possessions, a piece of metalwork that represents more wealth than most people in your village will ever own. Into the pot goes water, a handful of oats or barley, perhaps a small piece of preserved meat if there is any left, and whatever vegetables remain from last year's harvest. The result is pottage, a thin stew that will sustain you through the day. It is not particularly flavorful. The meat, if there is any, has been preserved with salt until it is more salt than meat. The vegetables are those that store well: turnips, parsnips, onions, and by this point in the winter, they have begun to soften and lose their freshness. But it is warm, and it fills your stomach, and it provides the energy needed to make it through another day. As the pottage cooks, sending up steam that adds moisture to the air and a small amount of warmth to the room, other members of your family begin to stir. The children wake first. Children always seem to have reserves of energy that adults have forgotten how to access. They huddle near the fire, pressing as close to the flames as they dare, extending small hands toward the warmth. Your spouse rises more slowly, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints ache from cold and whose body has been worn down by the constant effort of survival. There are no words of greeting. Conversation is a luxury when every breath creates a visible cloud and speaking means losing precious body heat through your mouth. Instead, there is the quiet efficiency of a family that has learned to work together without discussion. Someone tends the fire, adding wood piece by piece to keep the flame steady. Someone else checks on the animals, ensuring they have what little comfort can be provided. The children, despite their energy, know to stay close to the hearth, to move quietly, to avoid wasting the heat that the family has worked so hard to create. Breakfast, when it comes, is a ladleful of the pottage served in wooden bowls that retain no heat. You eat quickly, not because you are particularly hungry, but because warm food becomes cold food very rapidly in air this temperature. The meal provides a temporary internal warmth, a brief moment when your body feels less like it is fighting a battle against the cold. But the warmth fades quickly, and soon you must decide how to spend the precious daylight hours. In summer, this would be a time for field work, for tending crops, for the 100 different tasks that agricultural life requires. In winter, the options are more limited and more desperate. Firewood is always a priority. The small pile beside your hearth will not last through another day and night, and tomorrow will bring the same need for warmth. You take up your axe if you are fortunate enough to own one, or perhaps just a strong knife, and prepare for the walk to the edge of the village where deadfall might be found. The forest, what remains of it, lies perhaps a half-mile from your home. In summer, this is an easy walk across fields and meadows. In winter, it becomes an expedition. The frozen ground makes every step an effort. Your feet, already numb from cold, begin to ache as you walk across the hard, uneven surface. The forest itself offers mixed blessings. There is wood to be found, branches broken by winter storms, trees that have died and fallen. But there is also competition. Every family in the village has the same need, and the best wood, the driest, The most easily carried is taken quickly. Wet wood that must be dried before it will burn properly. Large branches that must be cut into smaller pieces. Logs that are too green to burn efficiently, but might be split and stored for later use. You work in the forest with the measured pace of someone who understands that energy, like wood is a finite resource. Every swing of the axe must count. Every step taken to collect fallen branches must be purposeful. The cold makes the work harder. Your hands grow numb inside whatever coverings you can manage, making it difficult to grip tools properly. Your breath comes in sharp puffs that freeze on any facial hair, creating small icicles that must be periodically wiped away. Other villagers work among the trees, each family focused on its own survival. There is little conversation. The cold makes talking painful. Everyone understands that energy spent on words is energy not available for the work of staying alive. Occasionally, two people might cooperate to move a large log or share the work of splitting a particularly difficult piece of wood. But these interactions are brief and purposeful. The return journey to your home is more difficult than the trip out. Now you carry wood as much as you can manage without exhausting yourself completely. The load makes you slower, and the extra effort required to transport fuel back to your hearth means that you arrive home more tired, colder, and with less energy remaining for the other tasks that winter survival requires. Back in your home, you stack the wood carefully beside the hearth. Wet wood goes in one pile, to be dried slowly by the heat of the fire. Dry wood, ready to burn, goes in another. Kindling the small pieces that catch flame is sorted into a separate pile. This organization is not just practical. It is essential. In the dark of a winter night, when the fire has burned low and needs feeding, you cannot afford to spend precious time sorting through the woodpile by feel. The afternoon brings other tasks. Food preparation occupies much of your time, though there is less food to prepare as winter deepens. What remains in your stores must be carefully managed. A handful of grain that might be made into bread, if you have the ingredients for bread. Preserved meat that must be soaked to remove some of the salt that keeps it from spoiling. Vegetables that need to be checked for signs of roteni spoiled food must be removed before it contaminates the rest of your winter stores. If your family owns animals, the afternoon is also time for their care. The goat needs attention, checking her health, ensuring she has adequate shelter, managing the small amount of milk she produces. Chickens require checking for eggs, feeding from your dwindling stores of grain, and protection from predators that become bolder as food becomes scarcer throughout the winter months. There is also the work of maintenance that cold weather makes necessary. The constant expansion and contraction caused by temperature changes means that gaps appear in walls, that roof coverings shift and allow drafts, that doors fit less tightly in their frames. You spend time pressing clay into cracks in the walls, adjusting the oiled cloth that covers your window opening, checking the thatch or wood shingles that keep rain and snow from entering your living space. These repairs are makeshift at best. You lack the resources for proper construction materials, and even if you possessed them, winter is not the time for major building projects. Instead, you make do stuff in gaps with straw, using whatever materials you can find to block drafts, accepting that your home will never be truly warm but working to make it less cold. As the short winter day begins to fade, the family gathers around the hearth again. This is not a choice made for comfort or sociability, it's simple survival. The fire represents the only source of heat in your world. Staying close to it is the only way to maintain enough body temperature to remain functional. The evening meal is much like the morning meal pottage, made from whatever ingredients remain available. By this point in the winter, variety has disappeared from your diet. You eat the same basic foods day after day, not from preference, but because these are the foods that store well enough to last through the cold months. Grain, preserved meat, root vegetables, whatever dairy products your animals can provide, these staples must sustain you until spring arrives and fresh food becomes available again. After the meal, as darkness settles over your village, there is little to do but wait for sleep. There is no artificial light except what the fire provides, and fuel is too precious to waste on illumination that serves no practical purpose. Reading is not an option even. If you possess the skill, books are luxuries far beyond your means. Entertainment consists of conversation, but even talking requires energy, and produces breath that carries away body heat. Instead, your family huddles close to the fire, sharing whatever warmth can be generated by your collective body heat. Children fall asleep first, curled up as close to the flames as safety allows. Adults remain awake longer, not by choice, but because someone must tend the fire through the night, adding wood when necessary to ensure that the flames never die completely. The fire that dies during the night might mean death for the family. Starting a fire from scratch, with flint and steel, or by trying to borrow coals from a neighbor, is possible but difficult and time-consuming. In the coldest weather, the delay might mean the difference between survival and freezing. So someone always stays awake, watching, adding fuel. Keeping the flames alive through the long, dark hours until morning comes again, you take your turn at fire watching, sitting close to the hearth while the rest of your family sleeps. The flames provide light enough to see their faces, your spouse, your children, perhaps other family members who share your small living space. In the firelight, they look peaceful, though you know that their sleep is not truly restful. Even asleep, their bodies work constantly to generate heat. They will wake tired from the effort of staying warm through the night. The night sounds of winter are different from those of other seasons. There is less noise. Overall, cold seems to muffle sound. And many of the animals that create the familiar noises of warmer months have either died, migrated, or fallen into the deep sleep of hibernation. What sounds do reach you are sharp and clear. The crack of wood in the fire, the occasional creak of your home's timber frame contracting in the cold, the sound of wind moving through bare trees. Occasionally, you hear sounds from other homes in your village, the bang of a door, the lowing of a cow, the cry of a child waking in the cold. These sounds are reminders that you are not alone in your struggle against winter, that your neighbors face the same challenges, make the same difficult choices, share the same quiet desperation that comes with knowing that spring is still months away. As you sit by the fire, feeding it small pieces of wood to keep the flames steady, you think about the calculations that govern your life. How much food remains in your stores? How much wood have you managed to collect? How many more days can your animals survive on the fodder you have saved for them? These are not abstract concerns, they are the mathematics of survival. And the answers determine whether your family will see spring. You think about the families in your village who have already lost members to the winter. The old woman who died in her sleep during a particularly cold night, found frozen in her bed when neighbors came to check on her. The infant who could not generate enough body heat to survive, despite being wrapped in every bit of cloth his parents could spare. The man who ventured too far from the village searching for food and was found days later, killed by exposure. These deaths are not tragedies in the way that modern people understand tragedy. They are simply facts of winter life, as predictable as frost on the windows or the need to break ice on water buckets each morning. You mourn them, but you do not dwell on them, because dwelling requires emotional energy that you need for the work of keeping your own family alive. The fire burns lower, and you add another piece of wood. The flames leap higher for a moment, casting moving shadows on the walls of your home. In those shadows, you can see the marks left by previous winter soot stains. Places where the walls have been patched, small carved symbols that might be prayers or simply the work of idle hands during long, dark evenings. Tomorrow will bring the same challenges as today. The animals will need tending. Firewood will need gathering. Food will need preparing from the dwindling supplies in your stores. You will wake to the sound of your own breathing in the cold air, rise from a straw mattress damp with frost, and begin again the quiet, desperate work of staying alive through another day of winter. But tonight, for this moment, there is warmth from the fire and the sound of your family breathing softly in sleep. The flames hold back the cold and the darkness, creating a small island of life in a world that has been claimed by winter. You pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders, add another small piece of wood to the fire, and settle in to wait for dawn. The rhythm of your days has been set by forces beyond your control, by the sun that rises late and sets early, by the cold that makes every task more difficult, by the simple fact that survival requires constant effort and constant vigilance. You have learned to move through this rhythm without thinking about it, to respond to winter's demands with the automatic efficiency of someone who understands that there is no choice, no alternative, no escape except endurance, and so you endure. One day at a time, one night at a time, one carefully tended fire at a time, the winter will end, eventually. Spring will return, bringing warmth and fresh food and relief from the constant battle against cold. But that is still months away, and you cannot think about months. You can only think about today, about tonight, about keeping the fire burning until morning comes again. Outside your small, warm circle of firelight, winter holds the world in its grip. But inside, you are alive, your family is alive, and the flames continue to burn. For now, that is enough. As the embers of our peasant fire fade into memory, let us drift elsewhere to another winter. Another life shaped by the same cold that pressed against humble cottage walls. The year is 1393, and in the prosperous merchant town of King's Lynn in Norfolk, a woman named Margery Kempe wakes to the sound of her own breath crystallizing in the air above her face. But Margery's morning is different from the peasant's dawn we have just witnessed. Her home is larger, built of stone and timber, with multiple rooms and glazed windows that let in precious light while keeping out some of the winter wind. Her husband John is a brewer and merchant, a man of some standing in their community. They have servants not many, but enough that Margery does not need to tend animals herself or carry water from frozen wells. Yet winter makes equals of peasant and merchant's wife in ways that wealth cannot entirely overcome. The cold seeps through stone walls as readily as through wattle and daub. Frost forms on the inside of even glazed windows. The hearth that dominates their main hall requires constant feeding, and the cost of fuel proper, seasoned wood. Not the scraps and deadfall that peasants gather represents a significant portion of the household's winter expenses. Margery rises from a bed that boasts a proper mattress stuffed with feathers rather than straw, covered with woolen blankets dyed in colors that speak of prosperity. But the luxury is relative. The bedchamber is barely warmer than the great hall below, and her breath still creates clouds in the morning air. Her clothing a linen shift, a woolen kirtle, heavy cloak lined with fur represents wealth, but it is wealth measured against the absolute poverty of winter itself. This morning, like so many mornings in the long winter of 1393, Margery feels the weight of something more pressing than cold. It is the weight of vision, of divine calling, of a voice that speaks to her in the silence between her heartbeats. She has been experiencing these visions for months now, encounters with Christ himself, conversations with the Virgin Mary, moments of spiritual transport that lift her above the mundane concerns of keeping house and managing servants and bearing children. The visions began during a difficult childbirth the previous year, when fever and pain opened doorways in her mind that had never been opened before. As she lay in her bed, more dead than alive, she saw Christ himself sitting at the foot of her bed, dressed in a purple silk mantle, his presence filling the room with warmth that had nothing to do with fire or wool or human bodies pressed together for comfort. Now, months later, these divine visitations continue. They come without warning, often at moments when the ordinary world presses most heavily upon her. When she is supervising the grinding of malt for her husband's brewery, Christ appears to speak of spiritual rather than worldly sustenance. When she is calculating the cost of winter fuel, the Virgin Mary reminds her that divine love provides warmth that no earthly fire can match. But the visions, however beautiful, however spiritually nourishing, do not make the work of winter survival any less necessary. Margery must still ensure that her household has adequate food stores, that the servants are properly clothed against the cold, that the fires are maintained throughout the long nights. The divine may speak to her of eternal matters, but the temporal world demands constant attention. She moves through her morning routine with the same careful deliberation as the peasant woman whose life we witnessed earlier. Though her tasks are different, instead of milking goats, she oversees the servants who prepare the morning meal. But instead of gathering firewood herself, she must calculate how much the household can afford to purchase from the woodcutters who supply the town's more prosperous families. The breakfast served in the Kempe household is more elaborate than peasant pottage, but it is still shaped by the limitations of winter. There is real bread, made from wheat flour rather than the barley and oat mixtures that sustain poorer families. There is ale brewed in John's own brewery. There is cheese from their stored supplies, and perhaps a small portion of preserved meat. But even this relatively luxurious meal carries the taste of winter about it. The bread is made from grain that has been stored for months. The cheese has the sharp flavor of aging. The meat is heavy with salt and smoke. As Margery eats, she listens to the sounds of her household waking to another winter day. servants moving about their tasks, the crackle of fires being built up after burning low through the night, the occasional sound of a door opening, and the rush of cold air that follows. These are comfortable sounds, the sounds of a well-ordered home, where winter's challenges are met with resources and planning, rather than desperate improvisation. But comfort, Margery has learned, is not the same as peace. Her visions have brought her a different kind of restlessness, spiritual hunger that cannot be satisfied by warm fires and adequate food. She feels called to something beyond the management of a prosperous household, called to pilgrimage, to prayer, to a life of devotion that sits uneasily with the practical demands of being a merchant's wife. After breakfast, she makes her way to the parish church of St. Margaret. The walk through King's Lynn streets is a journey from the relative warmth of her home into the full grip of winter. The cobblestones are slick with ice, and her breath creates clouds that hang in the still air before her face. Other townspeople move through the streets with the same careful gait of people navigating treacherous ground, merchants heading to their shops, servants running errands for their employers, clergy making their way between the town's several churches. The church itself offers a different kind of warmth from the hearth heat of home. St. Margaret's is built of stone, with thick walls and high ceilings that trap cold air like a bowl holds water. But there is warmth here nonetheless, the warmth that comes from community, from shared faith, from the presence of other souls, seeking comfort in divine rather than worldly things. Margery kneels before the altar, her knees pressing against stone that holds winter's chill like a sponge holds water. The cold seeps through the fabric of her dress, through her woolen hose into her bones. But she remains motionless, waiting for the voice that has become as familiar to her as her husband's snoring or the sound of servants preparing meals in the kitchen below her bedchamber. Today the voice comes quickly, cutting through the cold air of the church like a blade of warmth. Christ speaks to her of suffering, of the ways that physical discomfort can purify the soul, of how winter's trials prepare the spirit for spring's resurrection. His words fill her mind with visions of Jerusalem, of Calvary, of places where divine love triumphed over human pain. The vision lasts perhaps an hour, though time moves differently when the divine intersects with the mundane. When it ends, Margery finds herself still kneeling on the cold stone, her body stiff with cold, but her spirit burning with the warmth of divine encounter. Other parishioners have come and gone during her prayer, their footsteps echoing in the high stone spaces, their whispered prayers mixing with her own. She rises slowly, feeling the ache in her joints that winter makes familiar to everyone, regardless of their station in life. The walk home takes her again through streets where winter has transformed familiar sights into something strange and otherworldly. The market square, so bustling in warmer months, is nearly empty, except for a few vendors selling preserved foods and fuel. The houses she passes all show signs of the same battle against cold that occupies her own household, smoke rising from every chimney, windows shuttered tight against drafts, yards empty of the activities that fill them in more hospitable seasons. Back in her own home, Margery finds the servants tending to the work that winter makes necessary. Fires must be maintained in multiple rooms, not for comfort, but to prevent the household's stored goods from freezing. The brewery requires constant attention. Ale that freezes becomes undrinkable, and the family's prosperity depends on maintaining production even through the coldest months. She spends the afternoon in tasks that would be familiar to any woman of her time, regardless of social station. There are accounts to manage, calculating the cost of fuel, food, and other necessities against the household's income. There are servants to supervise, ensuring that work continues efficiently despite the challenges that cold weather brings to every task. There are children to tend to, and John have several, and children require constant attention to keep them warm and occupied during the long hours when outdoor activities are impossible. But even as she moves through these domestic responsibilities, part of Margery's attention remains focused on the spiritual realm that has become increasingly real to her. She finds herself pausing in her work to listen for the divine voice, to watch for signs that Christ or his mother might be preparing to speak with her again. The boundary between the practical and the mystical has become fluid in her experience, so that checking the household stores of preserved meat becomes an opportunity for meditation on spiritual nourishment, and calculating the cost of firewood becomes a reflection on the warmth of divine love. The dinner served in the Kempe household is the day's most substantial meal, though even prosperity cannot entirely overcome winter's limitations. There is meat, perhaps a joint of pork or beef that has been preserved since the autumn slaughter. There are vegetables from the household stores: onions, turnips, parsnips, and other roots that keep well through the cold months. There is bread and ale and cheese, and perhaps even some preserved fruit that adds sweetness to a meal otherwise dominated by the sharp flavors of salt, smoke, and age. The family eats by the light of candles and the glow of the great hall's fire. Conversation is quiet and practical discussion of the day's business, plans for tomorrow's activities, news from neighbors who have visited during the day. The children, bundled in woolen clothing that makes them look like small, round bundles, eat quickly and without complaint. They have learned, as all children of their time learn, that warmth is precious and should not be wasted on unnecessary movement or extended meals. After dinner, as darkness settles over King's Lynn like a heavy blanket, the household gathers around the great hall's fireplace. This is not entirely a matter of choice. Fuel is expensive, and it makes economic sense to heat only one room during the evening hours. But it also serves a social function, bringing the family together in a way that the scattered activities of daylight hours do not allow. Margery sits with her needlework, mending clothes that have been worn thin by constant use. In warmer months, clothing could be washed and aired regularly, but winter makes such luxury impossible. Instead, garments must be maintained through careful repair, patching, and the occasional addition of extra layers for warmth. Her needle moves through wool and linen with the automatic precision of someone who has been doing such work since childhood, but her mind drifts to the visions that increasingly dominate her inner life. She thinks about the pilgrimage to Jerusalem that Christ has been urging her to undertake. The journey would be expensive, dangerous, and difficult under the best of circumstances. In winter, it would be nearly impossible. But the divine call grows stronger each day, competing with her responsibilities as wife, mother, and household manager. John sits nearby, working on accounts by the light of the fire. The brewery business continues even through winter, though at a reduced pace. Ale is one of the few reliable sources of nutrition available during the cold months. The demand remains steady even as other forms of commerce slow to a crawl. But the costs of winter operation: fuel for the brewing fires, wages for servants who must work in difficult conditions, the expense of maintaining buildings against weather that threatens to damage anything left, unprotected eat into profits that must sustain the household through the lean months. The children play quiet games near the fire, their voices creating a soft murmur that blends with the crackle of burning wood and the occasional sound of wind moving around the house's eaves. Their games are simple stone games, word games, small diversions that require no equipment and can be played in the limited space around the hearth. They have learned, as children of winter learn, to entertain themselves with imagination rather than elaborate toys or extensive physical activity. Desolate, the evening progresses. Margery finds herself drawn again into prayer, though she remains sitting with her family around the fire. The divine presence that has become so familiar to her seems to intensify in the evening hours, when the business of the day gives way to quieter reflection. She prays for her family's continued prosperity, for the health of her children through the remaining winter months, for the success of John's business ventures. But increasingly, her prayers turn to more personal matters. To the growing certainty that she is being called to a life of more intensive spiritual devotion, and to the question of how such a calling can be reconciled with the practical responsibilities of her current life. The visions that began during her illness had become more frequent and more demanding, urging her toward pilgrimage, toward a more public expression of her faith, toward a way of life that sits uneasily with the expectations placed on a merchant's wife. The fire burns lower as the evening advances, and one by one the family members retire to their chambers. The children go first, bundled in layers of clothing that will help them stay warm through the night. John follows, after carefully banking the fire, so that it will burn slowly through the dark hours, without requiring constant attention. Margery remains alone in the great hall, sitting close to the dying fire with her prayers and her visions. This has become her practice, to use the quiet hours between the family's retirement and her own bedtime for intensive prayer and meditation. The house settles around her with the small sounds that winter nights bring, the creak of timber contracting in the cold, the whisper of wind through gaps in the walls, the distant sound of neighbors moving about their own evening routines. Tonight, as she sits in the firelight, Christ appears to her with particular vividness. He speaks of the importance of pilgrimage, of the spiritual growth that comes from leaving comfort behind and seeking Him in the holy places where His earthly life unfolded. The vision is so compelling that she finds herself weeping not from sadness, but from the overwhelming intensity of divine love that seems to fill the cold room with warmth more penetrating than any fire could provide. The vision fades gradually, leaving her alone again with the dying fire and the winter night. But its message remains clear. She is being called to something beyond the comfortable life of a prosperous merchant's wife. The pilgrimage to Jerusalem that has haunted her prayers for months is not merely a pious wish, it is a divine command that she will eventually have to obey. Regardless of the practical difficulties it will create, she rises from her chair beside the fire and makes her way through the dark house to her bedchamber. The stone floors are cold beneath her feet, and the corridors that connect the house's rooms seem to trap winter air like pools hold water. But she moves through the familiar spaces with the confidence of someone who has learned to navigate by touch and memory rather than sight. In her bedchamber, John sleeps soundly, his breathing creating small clouds that are visible in the faint light that filters through the shuttered windows. She undresses quickly, removing the layers of woolen clothing that have protected her from the day's cold, and slips beneath blankets that provide warmth without true comfort. The linen sheets are cold against her skin, and she curls into a position that conserves body heat while she waits for sleep. But sleep comes slowly on this winter night, as it does on many winter nights. Her mind remains occupied with the vision she has just experienced, with the growing certainty that her life is about to change in ways that she cannot yet fully imagine. The comfortable routine of household management, John's business ventures, of raising children and the security of a prosperous home, all of this may soon give way to something more uncertain but spiritually necessary. Outside her window, winter holds King's Lynn in the same grip that constrains peasant villages and noble castles alike. The cold makes no distinction between merchant and laborer, between the pious and the worldly. But inside the bedchamber, warmed by John's sleeping presence and wrapped in wool blankets that represent the family's prosperity, Margery drifts towards sleep with her heart, full of visions that promise to carry her far beyond the comfortable boundaries of her current life. Tomorrow will bring another day of winter survival, another round of household tasks and business concerns and domestic responsibilities. But it will also bring another opportunity for prayer, another chance for divine visitation, another step toward the pilgrimage that increasingly dominates her spiritual imagination. The visions that have transformed Margery's inner life spring from the same human need for warmth and comfort that drives the peasant to tend his fire through the night, and the noble to wrap himself in fur-lined robes. But where others seek warmth in earthly things, Margery has found a source of heat that burns regardless of season, the fire of divine love, that promises to sustain her through whatever cold trials may lie ahead. Sleep finally claims her. She dreams not of Jerusalem's holy sites or the hardships of pilgrimage, but of simpler things, of fires that never die, of rooms that hold warmth like cups hold water, of divine presence that makes winter itself into a season of spiritual spring. In her dreams, the cold that grips the world outside becomes merely the background against which divine warmth shines more brightly, and she sleeps peacefully in the knowledge that some forms of comfort transcend even winter's power to chill the human heart. Let us drift now from the warmth of individual lives into something deeper, more mysterious, into the archaeological whispers that speak to us across centuries of winter nights. Picture yourself not in any particular time or place, but in the space between knowing and wondering, where fragments of the past emerge from earth and stone to tell us stories we can only partially understand. In a field outside what was once a prosperous village in medieval Yorkshire, archaeologists in the 1970s made a discovery that seemed at first unremarkable. They found the remains of a peasant dwelling, its outline marked by post holes and stone foundations, its history written in layers of ash and debris that had accumulated over decades of habitation. But as they carefully excavated the site, sifting through centuries of accumulated earth, they began to uncover details that painted a remarkably intimate picture of how people lived through winter's grip. The central hearth, of course, was easy to identify, a circle of fire-blackened stones surrounded by layers of ash. So deep they spoke of countless nights when flames provided the only barrier between human life and winter's killing cold. Around this hearth, they found something unexpected. A series of raised platforms built into the walls of the dwelling, each about the length and width of a human body, each positioned to capture and hold the heat that radiated from the central fire. These were sleeping benches, beds that were not separate pieces of furniture, but integral parts of the house's architecture. Designed with the understanding that survival depended on never moving too far from warmth. Imagine yourself on such a bench, on a night when winter pressed against the walls with particular intensity. The stone and timber platform beneath you has been absorbing heat from the fire throughout the day, and now it releases that warmth slowly through the long dark hours. You lie on straw and rough blankets, but beneath them is stone that holds the day's fire like a memory, dating comfort upward into your body through the night. The sleeping bench is more than furniture. It is a technology of survival, a piece of engineering as essential as the hearth itself. Its placement in the room is calculated to capture the maximum benefit from the fire's heat, while remaining at a safe distance from the flames. Its construction uses materials that retain and slowly release thermal energy, turning the human bed into a kind of thermal battery that stores warmth for the hours when the fire burns low. But the sleeping benches found in that Yorkshire excavation held secrets beyond their practical function. Carved into the stone surfaces, worn smooth by centuries of bodies seeking warmth, the archaeologists found marks that defied easy explanation. Some were clearly decorative, simple geometric patterns, spirals, interlocking lines that might have been carved to pass time during the long winter evenings when there was little to do but wait for spring. Others were more puzzling. There were marks that might have been religious symbols, crosses, certainly, but also older signs that spoke of beliefs that existed alongside Christianity rather than being replaced by it. Small carved hollows that might have held offerings of food or drink or oil that could be lit to provide additional warmth and light. Scratches that formed patterns too regular to be accidental, but too abstract to be isolally interpreted. Were these marks spiritual in nature, prayers, carved in stone by people who understood that their survival depended on forces beyond their control? Were they practical marks to indicate which bench belonged to which family member, or records of some kind, or simple decoration to make harsh living spaces more human? Were they magical attempts to bind good fortune to the sleeping place, or to ward off the evil influences that winter nights were thought to bring? The archaeologists could not know. Marks themselves were all that remained of the complex web of beliefs and practices that surrounded winter survival in medieval times. But their presence suggests something profound about the relationship between the practical and the spiritual, between the need for physical warmth and the hunger for meaning that characterizes human life in all seasons. Imagine running your finger along these carved marks as you prepare for sleep, feeling the grooves that countless other fingers have traced before yours. Each mark represents a moment when someone like you, someone cold, someone tired, someone hoping to survive another night, reached out to touch something permanent, something that would outlast the immediate crisis of staying warm until morning. The hearthstones themselves tell their own mysterious stories. Chemical analysis of the Yorkshire site revealed layers of ash that spoke of different kinds of fuel burned over the decades of the dwelling's occupation. Wood ash, certainly oak and ash and beech from the forests that surrounded the village, but also peat ash from the boggy areas that provided fuel when wood was scarce, and the unmistakable residue of dried animal dung burned when no other fuel could be found. More intriguingly, the analysis revealed traces of materials that seemed to have no practical purpose as fuel. Aromatic herbs that would have provided pleasant scents when burned, rosemary, perhaps, or lavender, or other plants whose fragrance might have made the close, smoky air of the winter dwelling more bearable. These were luxuries that poor peasants could ill afford, yet they appear in the archaeological record with enough frequency to suggest that even the poorest families found ways to add small comforts to their harsh existence. Were these herbs burned for purely practical reasons, to mask the smells of unwashed bodies, cooking food, and animal presence that made winter dwellings places of concentrated odors? Or did they serve ritual purposes, part of the complex web of beliefs and practices that helped people make sense of their struggle against winter's power? In other excavations across medieval Europe, archaeologists have found similar traces of mystery embedded in the practical realities of winter survival. Near hearth sites, they discover caches of small objects that seem to have been deliberately buried, or hidden coins, jewelry, small carved figures, collections of stones or shells or other natural objects that have no obvious utilitarian purpose. Some of these may be simple hoards, valuable items hidden for safekeeping during times of uncertainty. But others suggest something more complex. The placement of objects near hearths, the careful burial of items that have no obvious monetary value, the arrangement of natural objects in patterns that seem too deliberate to be accidental. All this points to belief systems that treated the hearth as more than just a source of heat and light. Perhaps the hearth was understood as a kind of sacred space, the point where the human world intersected with forces beyond human control. Fire, after all, was a mysterious thing to people who did not understand combustion in scientific terms. It consumed fuel and gave warmth and light in return, but it was also unpredictable, dangerous, capable of destroying as well as sustaining life. The maintenance of fire required constant attention and skill, but it also seemed to depend on intangibles, luck, divine favor. The proper observance of customs and rituals that might influence whether flames would catch easily or die unexpectedly. In such a context, it makes sense that the hearth would become a focus for practices intended to ensure good fortune, to ward off malevolent influences, to maintain the proper relationship between human needs and cosmic forces. Imagine yourself sitting by your fire on a particularly cold night, adding not just wood to the flames, but also a small offering perhaps, a crust of bread that represents food shared with unseen powers, or a few drops of precious ale poured onto the stones as an acknowledgement that survival depends on more than human effort alone. The fire hisses and crackles as it consumes your offering, and for a moment, the flames seem to burn with a different quality of light, warmer and more protective than simple combustion can explain. Other archaeological finds add layers to this picture of winter hearth culture. Across Europe, excavators have found evidence of practices that seem designed to maximize the social and psychological benefits of gathering around fires. Hearths are often surrounded by evidence of craftwork areas, where people sat to spin thread, weave cloth, carve wood, or work leather, while benefiting from the fire's warmth and light. The arrangement of these work areas suggests careful planning. Family members seem to have had regular places around the hearth, positions that balanced access to heat and light with the practical requirements of different kinds of work. Children's areas, identified by the presence of small tools and toys, are positioned closest to the fire, where they would be warmest. Adults' workspaces are arranged in a rough hierarchy that may reflect family relationships, with the most skilled craftspeople, those whose work brought in the most resources, occupying the spots with the best access to warmth and illumination. This careful organization of hearth space speaks to the complex social dynamics that winter created. When families were forced to spend months in close proximity, with little privacy and constant stress from cold and hunger, the maintenance of social harmony became as important as the maintenance of fire itself. The hearth became not just a source of physical comfort, but a stage where family relationships were negotiated and maintained through the long, difficult months of winter survival. Archaeological evidence also suggests that hearths served important functions beyond the immediate family circle. In many medieval sites, excavators find hearths that are larger than household needs would require, with surrounding areas that could accommodate more people than typically lived in a single dwelling. These may be evidence of community practices, neighbors gathering to share fuel and warmth, or to engage in work that was more efficiently done in groups. Imagine your family's hearth on such a night, expanded beyond its usual circle to include neighbors whose own fuel has run low, or who have come to participate in some seasonal work that requires many hands. The fire burns brighter with shared fuel, and the warmth extends further with additional bodies gathered around the flames. Conversation flows more easily in the larger group, and for a few hours the isolation and anxiety of winter survival gives way to something resembling social pleasure. The archaeological record preserves traces of these gatherings in the form of debris that speaks to communal activities. Areas around large hearths often contain evidence of food preparation on a scale. Beyond normal household needs, large quantities of animal bones from shared meals, grinding stones worn smooth by the processing of grain for multiple families, storage areas that seem designed to hold resources for group consumption. There are also traces of activities that seem specifically designed for entertainment or social bonding. Gaming pieces carved from bone or wood, dice made from animal knuckles, Small musical instruments that could provide accompaniment for singing or dancing. These artifacts remind us that winter survival was not just a matter of staying alive, it was also about maintaining the social bonds and cultural practices that made life worth living. Some of the most intriguing archaeological finds related to winter hearth culture are the objects that seem to have no clear practical purpose. Small carved figures found buried near hearths, arrangements of stones that form patterns too complex to be accidental. Collections of natural objects, feathers, shells, unusual stones that seem to have been carefully gathered and preserved. These objects challenge our understanding of medieval life by suggesting that even people living at the edge of survival found ways to engage with beauty, mystery, and meaning. A small carved bird found near a Yorkshire hearth, worn smooth by handling, might have been a child's toy or a religious symbol, or simply something beautiful to hold during the long winter evenings. We cannot know its original purpose, but its presence in the archaeological record speaks to the human need for things that transcend mere utility. The mystery deepens when we consider the distribution of such objects across different sites. Similar carved figures appear in excavations separated by hundreds of miles, suggesting either trade networks that connected distant communities or shared cultural practices that spread across medieval Europe through mechanisms we do not fully understand. Were these objects part of a common belief system that helped people cope with winter's challenges? Did they represent shared symbols that carried meaning from community to community, creating connections between people who might never meet but who faced similar struggles? Or are the similarities simply coincidences, the result of human minds responding to similar challenges in similar ways? The archaeologists who study these sites can offer theories, but they cannot provide definitive answers. The objects themselves are mute, their original meanings lost with the people who created and used them. But their persistence in the archaeological record suggests that they served important functions in the lives of people who owned very little and could not afford to waste effort on things that did not matter. Perhaps the most mysterious aspect of medieval winter hearth culture is revealed in the chemical analysis of hearth stones themselves. Advanced techniques can detect trace amounts of substances that were burned in these fires, creating a kind of chemical memory of winter nights that occurred centuries ago. In addition to the expected residues of wood, peat, and dung, these analyses sometimes reveal the presence of materials that seem to have no practical purpose. Exotic spices that would have been enormously expensive, aromatic resins that would have created unusual scents when burned, even traces of materials that might have been hallucinogenic. Were these substances burned for their psychoactive properties, as part of rituals designed to induce visions or altered states of consciousness during the long winter nights? Were they medicines, burned to release their healing properties into the air that families breathed? Were they simply luxuries, brief moments of sensory pleasure in lives otherwise dominated by hardship and deprivation? The chemical evidence cannot tell us. It can only confirm that these substances were present, that people living centuries ago found ways to obtain and use materials that seemed far beyond their economic means. The implications are tantalizing, but ultimately unresolvably another mystery, embedded in the practical realities of winter survival. Imagine yourself adding a small amount of some precious substance to your fire, perhaps a few grains of imported spice saved from a summer trading fair, or a piece of aromatic wood carried from a distant forest. The flames consume it quickly, but for a few moments the air in your small dwelling is transformed, filled with scents that speak of warmth and abundance in places where winter does not hold such power over human life. As you sit by your fire, breathing air that carries traces of luxury and mystery, you might feel connected to something larger than your immediate struggle for survival. The exotic scents might remind you that there are other places, other seasons, other ways of being human that do not require constant vigilance against cold and hunger. For just a moment, the boundaries of your small, cold world expand to include possibilities that normally exist only in imagination. The sleeping bench beneath you holds the day's warmth. The carved marks that your fingers trace connect you to generations of people who faced similar challenges. And the fire before you burns with substances that speak of connections to distant places and practices. In this moment, surrounded by mystery and sustained by tradition, you understand that winter survival is not just about staying alive. It is about maintaining your humanity in circumstances that constantly threaten to reduce you to mere biological survival. The fire burns lower, and you add another piece of wood, perhaps touching one of the small carved marks on your sleeping bench as you settle back against the warm stone. Outside, winter continues its patient assault on the world. But inside your small circle of warmth and mystery, you remain connected to the complex web of beliefs, practices, and relationships that make survival not just possible, but meaningful. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new needs for fuel and food, and the thousand small tasks that winter survival requires. But tonight, surrounded by the traces of those who came before and the mysteries they left behind, you rest in the knowledge that human life has always found ways to create meaning, even in the face of circumstances that seem designed to crush all meaning from existence. The archaeological record preserves only fragments of this rich tapestry of winter survival, a few carved marks, some chemical traces, the outline of sleeping benches built into walls that have long since crumbled. But these fragments are enough to remind us that even in history's coldest nights, people found ways to create warmth that went beyond the merely physical, to maintain connections that transcended the immediate crisis of staying alive through another winter's day. From the mysteries carved in peasant stone, let us drift upward through the social order to places where winter's grip was softened but never entirely loosened by wealth, privilege, and the complex machinery of medieval power. Picture yourself not in a single room dwelling with animals sharing your warmth, but in the great hall of a manor house, where fires burn in hearths large enough to roast an entire ox, and where the very architecture speaks of humanity's attempt to create barriers against winter's dominion. The year is 1348, and we find ourselves in the household of Sir Geoffrey de Montfort, whose manor sits on a rise of land in Warwickshire. Its stone walls and slate roofs, a declaration of permanence in a world where most human dwellings are built of materials that winter can easily claim. But permanence, as we shall see, is relative when winter itself becomes the enemy. Sir Geoffrey wakes in a chamber that would seem luxurious beyond imagination to the peasants whose lives we have already witnessed. His bed is not a sleeping bench built into the wall, but a massive construction of carved oak, hung with curtains of fine wool that create a smaller, warmer space within the already enclosed room. The mattress beneath him is stuffed with down rather than straw, as the blankets that cover him are made of wool so fine it might have come from sheep raised specifically for their soft fleece. Yet even here, in this pinnacle of medieval comfort, winter makes its presence known. Sir Geoffrey's breath creates small clouds in the morning air. Frost has formed on the inside of his chambers, glazed windows glass being one of the ultimate luxuries of his time, a barrier against winter that peasants could never afford. The stone walls that provide such impressive protection against human enemies prove less effective against the patient assault of cold, which seeps through mortar and finds its way around shutters, with the persistence of water finding its way downhill. He rises from his warm nest of down and wool into air that seems to bite at his exposed skin, reaching immediately for the fur-lined robe that hangs beside his bed. This robe represents wealth beyond calculation, the pelts of animals trapped in distant forests, prepared by skilled craftsmen, sewn together to create a garment that weighs nearly as much as a suit of mail, but provides warmth that armor never could. The walk from his bedchamber to the great hall takes Sir Geoffrey through corridors that demonstrate both the possibilities and the limitations of medieval heating technology. Braziers burn at intervals along the passageway's metal bowls, filled with glowing charcoal that provide pools of warmth in the stone-cold spaces between rooms. But the heat from these braziers extends only a few feet, creating islands of comfort and seas of chill that make rapid movement between warm spaces a necessity. The Great Hall itself represents the medieval elite's most ambitious attempt to create truly warm interior space. The room is vast by the standards of any age, high-ceilinged, with walls that could accommodate a small peasant dwelling in their thickness. At one end, a fireplace large enough for several people to stand inside burns with a fire that consumes wood at a rate that would heat a peasant family for weeks. But the very size that makes the hall impressive also makes it nearly impossible to heat effectively. The fire, enormous as it is, must warm a space that could hold hundreds of people, and much of its heat simply rises to the high ceiling and disappears. Despite the massive consumption of fuel, despite the advanced design of the fireplace and chimney, despite the wealth that makes such extravagance possible, the Great Hall remains a place where those seated near the fire are comfortably warm while those at the far end of the room shiver in conditions little better than those outside. Sir Geoffrey takes his place at the high table, positioned to receive maximum benefit from the fire's warmth, while also demonstrating his status as master of the household. The breakfast served here is a sharp contrast to the thin pottage that sustains peasant families. There is white bread made from the finest wheat flour, butter churned from the cream of well-fed cows, cheese aged in the manor's own cellars, preserved meats that have been smoked and salted with expensive spices. Yet even this abundance carries winter's signature. The bread, though made from premium ingredients, still tastes of the storage cellars where grain has been kept since harvest. The butter, though rich and fresh-tasting, must be carefully rationed because the cows give less milk in the cold months. The preserved meats, though prepared with the finest techniques available, still carry the sharp flavors of salt and smoke that mark them as food stored against scarcity, rather than fresh provisions prepared for immediate consumption. As Sir Geoffrey eats, he is surrounded by the elaborate rituals that demonstrate his household's attempt to maintain civilized life despite winter's challenges. Servants move efficiently between the kitchen and the hall, carrying dishes that must be served quickly before they cool in the drafty spaces between hearth and table. Musicians play softly from a gallery above the main floor, their instruments requiring constant attention because wooden instruments crack in the dry air created by the great fire, and because fingers numbed by cold cannot move with their usual dexterity. The very presence of these musicians, these servants, these elaborate rituals of service, presents a form of defiance against winter's power to reduce human life to its most basic elements. Where peasants must focus entirely on survival, the wealthy can afford to maintain the complex social structures that mark the difference between existing and living well. But the maintenance of such structures requires constant effort and enormous resources. Sir Geoffrey spends a significant portion of his morning reviewing accounts with his steward, calculating the cost of the fuel needed to maintain fires throughout the manor, the expense of feeding servants and animals through the winter months, the careful allocation of stored food supplies that must last until spring provides fresh alternatives. The numbers are sobering, even for a household of considerable wealth. The amount of wood consumed by the manor's fires in a single winter day would provide fuel for a peasant family for a month. The cost of maintaining the glass windows that provide light while keeping out wind represents more money than most people will see in their entire lives. The servants required to tend fires, prepare meals, and maintain the complex systems that make comfortable winter life possible consume food and wages that dwarf the resources available to ordinary families. Yet even these enormous expenditures cannot entirely overcome winter's dominion. Sir Geoffrey moves through his manor during the morning hours, inspecting the various activities that keep his household functioning. He encounters the same fundamental challenges that face people of every social level. Pipes freeze despite being insulated with straw and cloth. Stored food shows signs of spoilage despite careful preservation techniques. Servants fall ill from the constant exposure to cold that their duties require. In the manor's chapel, Sir Geoffrey joins his household for morning prayers, kneeling on stone floors that seem to draw heat from his body through the thick wool of his hose. The chapel is unheated, except for a small brazier near the altar, and the priest's voice echoes strangely in air so cold that each word creates a visible puff of breath. The prayers offered here include specific requests for protection against winter's dangers, for the preservation of stored food supplies, for the health of animals and servants, for the successful navigation of the months that remain before spring's return. These prayers reflect a worldview in which winter is understood not merely as a season, but as a force of cosmic significance, a test of human endurance that reveals the fragility of civilization itself. Even the wealthy, even those with resources to maintain elaborate defenses against cold and hunger, to understand that their comfort depends on forces beyond their control, on the weather patterns that determine whether stored fuel will be adequate, on the health of animals that provide food and warmth, on the complex network of trade and production that makes luxury possible. After morning prayers, Sir Geoffrey makes his way to the manor's solar, a smaller, more intimate room that serves as his private study and sitting room. The solar is easier to heat than the great hall, with a smaller fireplace that can warm the space more effectively. Here, surrounded by books bound in leather and vellum, by tapestries that provide both beauty and insulation, by the accumulated treasures that represent his family's wealth and status. He conducts the business that maintains his position in the complex hierarchy of medieval society. The solar's windows provide a view across the winter, the landscape that surrounds the manor fields lying fallow under a coating of frost, forests stripped bare of leaves, roads that have become nearly impassable with mud and ice. From this elevated perspective, Sir Geoffrey can see the village that depends on his manor for protection and governance. Its humble buildings clustered around the church like sheep seeking shelter from a storm. The view reminds him of the responsibilities that accompany his privileged position. The peasants whose lives we witnessed earlier in our journey are his tenants, their survival during winter months dependent not only on their own efforts, but on the decisions he makes about rent collection, about the distribution of stored grain, about the maintenance of the social order that provides stability in exchange for service. These responsibilities weigh heavily during winter months, when the margin between survival and disaster narrows for everyone, regardless of social position. Sir Geoffrey must balance his household's needs against his obligations to his tenants, his own family's comfort against the welfare of the broader community. That the afternoon brings visitors, other members of the local nobility, who have ventured out despite winter's challenges to conduct business or maintain social connections that transcend seasonal difficulties. Their arrival is marked by elaborate rituals of hospitality that demonstrate the household's wealth and status, while also providing practical comfort to travelers who have endured long journeys through harsh conditions. The visitors are escorted to chambers where fires have been specially built for their comfort, provided with heated wine and warm food, offered the opportunity to change from travel-stained clothing into garments dried by the manor's fires. Their horses are stabled and fed, their servants provided with quarters near the kitchen where they can share in the warmth generated by cooking fires. The conversation that fills the afternoon touches on matters, both practical and political reports of winter conditions throughout the region, news of trade disruptions caused by weather, discussions of the complex relationships between local nobility and the broader networks of power that govern medieval society. But underneath these formal topics runs a current of shared understanding about winter's power to disrupt even the most carefully laid plans. One visitor reports that a bridge has been destroyed by ice, cutting off trade routes that normally provide winter supplies to several communities. Another describes a manor house where inadequate fuel supplies have forced the evacuation of most servants, leaving the noble family living in conditions barely better than those of their peasant tenants. A third brings news of villages where stored grain has been lost to vermin or spoilage, creating the threat of famine before spring's arrival. These reports serve as reminders that winter's challenges transcend social boundaries, that even wealth and privilege provide only partial protection against forces that can destroy the foundations of civilized life. The visitors sharing Sir Geoffrey's fire represent the pinnacle of their society's hierarchy. Yet their conversation reveals the same anxieties, the same careful calculations of resources against time, that occupy peasant families huddled around their own smaller fires. As evening approaches, the manor's great hall is prepared for the day's most elaborate meal. Servants arrange tables in a configuration that balances social hierarchy with practical considerations about heat distribution. The high table, where Sir Geoffrey and his most important guests will sit, is positioned to receive maximum benefit from the great fireplace. Lesser tables are arranged in order of decreasing proximity to the fire, creating a physical map of social relationships that also reflects access to comfort. The meal itself represents the medieval elite's most ambitious attempt to deny winter's power over human. Multiple courses arrive in succession: roasted meats that require enormous fires to prepare, elaborate pastries that demonstrate the availability of expensive ingredients, dishes flavored with spices that have traveled thousands of miles to reach this table in the depths of winter. Yet even this feast carries subtle reminders of seasonal constraints. Much of the meat has been preserved since the autumn slaughter, and despite skilled preparation, it bears the flavors of salt and smoke that mark it as stored rather than fresh food. The vegetables, though prepared with great skill, are limited to those varieties that store well through winter months. The spices, though precious and exotic, are used partly to mask the tastes of preservation that no amount of wealth can entirely eliminate. The dining itself requires elaborate coordination to ensure that food remains warm during its journey from kitchen fires to dining tables. Servants move in carefully orchestrated patterns, carrying dishes that must be served immediately before they cool in the drafty spaces of the great hall. The guests eat quickly, not from hunger, but from the understanding that warm food becomes cold food very rapidly in winter air. Entertainment follows the meal, musicians performing songs that speak of spring and summer, of warmth and abundance, of seasons when the natural world supports rather than threatens human life. The music serves as more than mere amusement. It functions as a form of collective resistance against winter's psychological as well as physical assault. A reminder that the current season of hardship is temporary and that warmth will eventually return. As the evening advances, the great hall gradually empties as guests and household members retire to their chambers. The process is carefully managed to conserve heat. Fires are banked rather than extinguished. Braziers are moved to provide warmth in corridors that must be traversed. Arrangements are made to ensure that no one must venture far from warmth without adequate protection. Sir Geoffrey makes his final rounds of the manor, checking on fires that must burn through the night, ensuring that servants responsible for maintaining heat have adequate fuel and clear instructions. Visiting the stables where valuable horses depend on human care for their winter survival. These rounds take him through spaces where the illusion of warmth created in the great hall gives way to the reality of winter's persistent presence. In the stables, despite thick walls and the warmth generated by the animals themselves, his breath creates clouds in the cold air. In the kitchens, despite the heat from cooking fires, ice forms in water buckets left too far from the hearths. In the servants' quarters, despite their proximity to the main house's heating systems, people sleep bundled in every piece of clothing they own. These observations remind Sir Geoffrey that his household's comfort, impressive as it may seem, represents only a partial victory over winter's power. The manor's wealth allows for larger fires, better food, more elaborate defenses against cold. But it cannot entirely eliminate the fundamental challenges that winter presents to human life. Returning to his own chamber, Sir Geoffrey finds that servants have prepared it for the night with the same elaborate care that marks all aspects of his households. The fire has been built up to provide maximum heat. Warming pans filled with glowing coals have been placed between the bed sheets. Extra blankets have been arranged to provide additional insulation against the night's cold. Yet as he prepares for sleep, removing the layers of wool and fur that have protected him through the day, he feels the immediate bite of winter air against his skin. The chamber that seemed comfortably warm while he was fully dressed reveals its limitations. When he must rely on bedclothes alone for protection against cold, he slips quickly between sheets that have been warmed by the servants' careful preparations. Pulling heavy blankets up to his chin and drawing the bed curtains closed to create an even smaller, warmer space within the already enclosed room. The curtains serve a practical as well as decorative purpose, trapping his body heat and creating a microclimate that allows for comfortable sleep despite the cold air that fills the rest of the chamber. As he lies in his warm nest, listening to the sounds of wind moving around the manor's walls and the distant crackle of fires being maintained by servants throughout the building, Sir Geoffrey reflects on the complex relationship between power and vulnerability that winter reveals. His wealth provides defenses against cold that peasants cannot imagine, yet those defenses require constant maintenance, enormous resources, and the coordinated efforts of dozens of people. The manor that seems so solid and permanent during daylight hours reveals its fragility in the quiet hours of the winter night. Ice forms on the inside of windows despite their expensive glass. Drafts find their way through gaps in stone walls despite careful construction. Fires consume fuel at rates that make even wealthy households anxious about their winter stores. Most tellingly, the comfort that wealth provides depends entirely on the willing service of people who themselves have little protection against winter's assault. The servants who maintain the fires, who prepare the food, who care for the animals, who perform the 100 daily tasks that make luxurious life possible, these people sleep in quarters that are barely warmer than peasant dwellings, eat food that differs little from peasant meals, face the same risks of illness and death that threaten all human life during winter's grip. Sir Geoffrey's comfort, in other words, is built on a foundation of shared vulnerability, maintained by the efforts of people whose own survival is far from assured. This understanding brings with it a weight of responsibility, but also a recognition of the fundamental equality that winter imposes on all human life. Rich and poor alike must breathe air that turns to clouds, must seek warmth from fires that consume fuel faster than it can be gathered, must depend on stored food that diminishes with each passing day. Outside his warm bed, winter continues its patient siege of the manor, probing for weaknesses in walls and roofs, testing the adequacy of fuel supplies and food stores, threatening the complex systems that make civilized life possible. But inside the curtained space of his bed, surrounded by the finest materials that medieval craftsmanship can provide, Sir Geoffrey finds a temporary refuge that allows him to sleep despite the cold that grips the world beyond his walls. His sleep, when it comes, is filled with dreams that echo the day's concerns, visions of empty storerooms and failed fires, of servants falling ill and animals dying, the careful balance between comfort and survival that defines winter life for people of all social positions. But the dreams also include images of spring's return, of warmth that requires no fuel to maintain, of abundance that makes hoarding unnecessary. When morning comes, Sir Geoffrey will wake to face another day of winter's challenges, another round of decisions about fuel and food and the maintenance of the social order that makes his privileged life possible. But tonight, protected by wealth and wool and the devoted service of his household, he rests in the knowledge that power, however fragile, provides real comfort to those fortunate enough to possess it. The manor sleeps around him, its fires carefully tended by servants who understand that their own survival depends on maintaining the warmth that makes their master's comfort possible. In the great hall, embers glow in the massive fireplace, ready to be coaxed back to flame when morning comes. In the stables, horses stand close together, sharing warmth while they wait for spring pastures. In the village beyond the manor's walls, peasant families huddle around their own smaller fires, dreaming their own dreams of warmth and survival. All of them, noble and peasant, master and servant, human and animal, share the same fundamental relationship with winter, the same dependence on fire and food and shelter for their continued existence. The differences in their circumstances are real and significant, but they are differences of degree rather than kind. Winter makes philosophers of them all, teaching the same lessons about vulnerability and endurance, about the value of warmth and the preciousness of life, about the thin margins that separate comfort from catastrophe in a world where cold can kill and darkness can last for months. And so our gentle journey through history's coldest nights draws to its close. Like embers settling into ash, like breath dissolving in winter air, like the quiet moment when sleep finally claims the restless mind, we have walked together through centuries of human endurance, felt the bite of air that turned breath to crystal, shared the precious warmth of fires that held back darkness and death with equal determination. Think for a moment about the distance we have traveled, not in miles, but in understanding. We began in the single room of a peasant dwelling, where survival was measured in handfuls of grain and pieces of firewood, where each day's continuation was a small victory, against forces that seemed designed to crush human life back into the earth from which it came. We felt the weight of wooden shoes on frozen ground, tasted the thin pottage that sustained families through months when fresh food was only a memory, understood the quiet desperation that came with knowing that spring was still countless sunrises away. From that humble hearth, we drifted into the more comfortable but no less challenging world of Margery Kempe, where prosperity provided better walls and warmer clothing, but could not silence the deeper hungers of the human spirit. We saw how even merchant wealth could not entirely overcome winter's dominion, how divine visions might burn brighter than any earthly fire, how the search for spiritual warmth could grow from the same soil that nurtured the simple need to survive another night. Our journey then carried us into the realm of mystery, into the archaeological whispers that speak across centuries of winter survival. We traced carved marks left by hands that reached toward permanence in a world of constant change, breathed air scented with exotic substances that spoke of connections beyond the immediate struggle for heat and food, rested on sleeping benches that held the day's warmth like stones hold sunlight. Finally, we ascended to the great halls where wealth attempted to deny winter's power entirely, where massive fires consumed fuel at rates that would sustain peasant families for months, where elaborate rituals of hospitality and service created islands of comfort and seas of seasonal hardship. Yet even there, in those pinnacles of medieval luxury, we found the same fundamental truth that governed every life we encountered. Winter made philosophers of them all, teaching identical lessons about vulnerability and endurance, about the value of warmth and the preciousness of each day that brought them closer to spring's return. What strikes us most profoundly as we reflect on these interwoven stories is not the differences between peasant and noble, between the desperate and the comfortable, but the common threads that connected all human experience during those long winter months. Every person we met, regardless of their station in life, woke to the sound of their own breathing in cold air. Every hearth we visited, whether built of rough stones or carefully cut masonry, served the same essential function of holding back the darkness and cold that would otherwise reclaim human spaces for the wild. The carved marks we found in peasant sleeping benches spoke the same language as the elaborate tapestries that warmed noble halls. Both were attempts to create meaning and beauty in circumstances that constantly threatened to reduce life to its most basic elements. The thin pottage that sustained farming families and the elaborate feasts that graced high tables were different expressions of the same fundamental need to transform raw survival into something resembling civilization. Even the distinctions between practical and spiritual, between survival and meaning-making, dissolve when we consider the full scope of winter's impact on medieval life. The peasant who carved protective symbols near his hearth and the noble, who maintained elaborate chapels, were both acknowledging that human life depends on forces beyond human control, that the successful navigation of winter's challenges required attention to mysteries as well as mundane tasks. The archaeological evidence we explored, those traces of exotic substances burned in humble hearths, those carefully arranged collections of seemingly useless objects, those sleeping benches positioned with mathematical precision to capture maximum warmth, reminds us that even people living at the edge of survival found ways to engage with beauty, mystery, and transcendence. The human spirit, it seems, requires more than mere survival, even when survival itself demands constant vigilance and effort. As we consider the lives we have witnessed, we begin to understand that winter served as more than just a season to be endured. It functioned as a great equalizer, a teacher, a revealer of fundamental truths about the human condition that more comfortable seasons might allow us to ignore. In the face of cold that could kill, and darkness that could last for months, the usual hierarchies and distinctions that governed medieval society revealed their ultimate fragility. The noble in his fur-lined robe and the peasant in his rough woolen cloak both needed fire to survive the night. The merchant's wife with her glazed windows and the farmer's daughter with her oiled cloth covering both watched their breath turn to clouds in the morning air. The elaborate feast and the simple meal of preserved turnips both represented the same fundamental victory, another day of successfully transforming stored resources into the energy needed to continue living. But perhaps the most moving aspect of our journey has been the recognition of how much human warmth, literal and metaphorical, depended on cooperation, sharing, and the maintenance of social bonds that transcended individual survival. The peasant family that brought their goat inside for the night understood that survival was a collective enterprise. The neighbors who gathered around community hearths to share fuel and work and conversation were practicing a form of mutual aid that made individual endurance possible. Sir Geoffrey's Manor, for all its impressive displays of wealth and power, functioned only because dozens of people willingly performed the tasks that maintained warmth and comfort for the household. The servants who tended fires through the night, who prepared food in cold kitchens, cared for animals in unheated stables. Their labor was what transformed wealth into actual warmth, its potential into realized comfort. Even Margery Kempe's spiritual visions, seemingly the most individual and private of all the experiences we encountered, connected her to broader networks of meaning and community. Her divine encounters grew from traditions of mystical experience that linked her to others across time and space, who had found similar warmth in spiritual rather than purely material sources. The mysteries we explored, those carved marks, those exotic substances, those carefully preserved collections of beautiful objects, suggest forms of sharing and connection that transcended the immediate household or community. The similarity of symbols across vast distances, the presence of expensive materials in humble dwellings, the persistence of practices that seem to serve no practical purpose, all point to networks of cultural exchange that continued to function even when winter made travel difficult and dangerous. As we prepare to let sleep claim us, as we settle into beds that would seem impossibly luxurious to any of the people whose lives we have shared. It's worth reflecting on how much we take for granted that they would have considered miraculous. The simple act of adjusting a thermostat represents power over winter that medieval people could scarcely imagine. Our heated homes, our abundant food supplies, our electric lights that banish darkness at the touch of a switch, all of these represent victories over the forces that made winter such a formidable opponent for our ancestors. Yet their struggles were not in vain, and their victories were not meaningless simply because they were temporary. Every fire they maintained through a winter night was an act of defiance against the forces that would reduce human life to mere biological survival. Every meal they shared, however simple, was a celebration of community and continuity. Every mark they carved, every symbol they preserved, every moment of beauty they created in the midst of hardship was a declaration that human life means more than just staying alive. The warmth they created in their hearths, in their communities, in their spiritual practices, in their simple determination to continue existing despite overwhelming challenges, continues to reach us across the centuries. When we read about their lives, when we try to understand their struggles, when we recognize our connection to their fundamental human experiences, we become part of the same project of meaning-making that sustained them through their darkest seasons. Their winter nights, with all their hardship and uncertainty, also contained moments of profound peace, the quiet satisfaction of a fire burning steadily, the comfort of family members breathing softly in sleep, the simple pleasure of warmth after cold, of rest after labor, of another day successfully navigated in the long journey towards spring. These moments of peace are what we carry with us as we drift towards sleep. What we share across the centuries with people who face challenges we can barely imagine yet found ways. It's not merely to survive, but to remain fully human in the face of circumstances that threaten to strip away everything except the bare necessities of existence. Their breathing, which turned to clouds in the cold air of their simple dwellings, mingles now with our own breath as we settle into beds warmed by technologies they could not have conceived. Their dreams of springs return echo in our own dreams. As we let consciousness fade into the quiet darkness that connects all sleepers across all seasons, the fires they tended so carefully through countless winter nights have become the warmth that surrounds us now, not just the physical warmth of our heated homes, but the cultural warmth of connection to others who shared our fundamental human experiences. The spiritual warmth of understanding that survival and meaning-making are not separate projects, but aspects of the same essential human work. Outside our windows, whatever season claims the world at this moment, winter waits with the same patience it showed our ancestors, ready to test human ingenuity and endurance, ready to remind us of our dependence on forces beyond our control, ready to teach the same lessons about the value of warmth and community and the immense determination to continue existing despite challenges that sometimes seem designed to overwhelm human life entirely. But we sleep now in the knowledge that others have faced winter's trials and found ways to create warmth, meaning, and beauty, even in the coldest nights history has ever known. Their quiet victories over cold and darkness and despair have become part of the inheritance they left us, part of the warmth that sustains us still. Sleep well, knowing that you are connected across time to countless others who faced the darkness with courage, who tended their fires with patience, who found ways to remain human and hopeful even when spring seemed impossibly distant. Their warmth is your warmth. Their endurance is your heritage. Their peaceful sleep in the midst of winter's trials is the gift they offer to your own rest. The fire burns low, the night is quiet, and sleep comes softly, carrying with it the accumulated wisdom of all those who learned to find warmth in the coldest times, peace in the midst of struggle, and hope in the certain knowledge that winter, however long and dark, always gives way eventually to spring, and dream of warmth that requires no fuel, of fires that never die, of seasons when survival becomes celebration, and the simple act of being alive reveals itself as the victory it has always been. End of journey. Sleep well.